Actually, to clarify that a little bit, in the countryside, barns where the hay mow or the hay loft was probably 5 times larger than this particular hay loft. But we've assembled here tools that were either used with the hands of people or drawn by a one horse. Beginning, one horse was available, and later teams of horses pulled some of the equipment. Most all of this is homemade. Most all of it is made out of wood. Our whole emphasis in this building is that the usage of wood was the buzzword. We actually arranged the equipment to relate to the spring work, to the summer work, to the harvest in the fall, and then into the winter work. And on the family farms there was continuous work in all of those 4 seasons. We also sometimes refer to it as a circle of life, because we have a very primitive cradle that's was used, and we sort of have the circle of life from the cradle, and then in the corner here before we go down is the coffin, and that's the circle of life. That's the circle of seasons, and it was repetitious year after year after year after year from the very beginning of when they cultivated the soils. The very first hanging tool is, of course, a shovel or a spade that was used to till the garden, which was the primary source of food for them. And then, of course, ironically in life, the spade or the shovel is used to put people into the cemeteries when they're buried, of course. So, but it was a life of depending on growing things every year, and the maturing of seeds brought them closer to God and brought them closer to a religious life because there was a dependency of continually growing things that were needed for the large families year after year. And of course there were no stores or nothing available to be purchased in the first several decades of when the immigrants first came to this area. Contains tillage equipment. As mentioned before, the real simple shovel and the spade was the first tillage piece of equipment used by hand to turn soil in into the gardens. The common practice was to turn the soil over and then take a hoe and something to make it into a fine dry mixture, ideally to plant seeds. Some of these equipment that is primarily wood are handmade or homemade. As in a few years of development and progress, then when there's more metal or iron, as this one horse drawn plow or a one furrow plow, that they were factory made. Many of the towns had small factories that would specialize in plows and in drags. They had a plow, this one for example, simply to make a furrow for potatoes. Potatoes and beans and corn. Potatoes was one of the most common things that was grown, and it would reproduce in a matter of just a few months with ideal growing conditions. And so then corn was planted by hand with a device, and actually to the point that it was a hill was put every 40 inches, preferably every 42 inches. The width of the corn rows were designed so that one horse could walk between the rows to cultivate, to keep the weeds down, and the corn was situated in the cultivated fields that they could go crisscross. And so the corn, the early years, a horse and a flexible spike cultivator would go between the rows so that no weeds would ever grow. Some of these are extremely innovative, all made out of wood. This is a top of a land roller that was made locally, as were some of those they were made spring tooth or spike tooth arrows we called, and so they were made locally by a Hessian family. And as things progressed in the family units, I think I should clarify that the first German immigrants here did not move into town, that nearly every family bought from 40 to 60 to 80 acres to clear and then to have ground soil to provide for themselves, and then in future years for the animals that they would secure. Cows and chickens and possibly horses were added, and the more cows and the more animals that were grown or used on the farm, that created another responsibility to provide food for the animals, depending on the number of animals that they had. Keep in mind that we live in an area of the world where the seasons change and crops only grow once in a season, and that's of course necessitated the fact that they had to build large barns for the accumulation of long stemmy hay to feed those horses and feed those cows, and the cows of course provided the meat and the milk and an offspring, and the horses provided simply the power to pull the ever-increasing larger machineries to till the soil. We have a very unique system in the in the point of this roof, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, almost 6 devices that would bring in the hay for the food, basic food for animals, and straw for the bedding of the stables, and then of course that created a manure, and of course that created another cycle of the stemmy straw to go back onto the soil as fertilizer. In the early days, the only fertilizer added to the soils were that of humans and of animals, and at that point that certainly benefited a greater yield of whatever was chosen. What is extremely interesting is that on many occasions, whatever small piece of equipment was made was simply made from a tree, and this is a homemade shovel that goes to about the 1850s, possibly the 1840s, and the width of the shovel is from the trunk of the tree, and the handle is actually the limb of a tree, and it was a useful thing for small grains. The very early years, one of the more popular crops grown was flax, and flax has a stemmy stem that they would soak and beat and honestly twist and weave into a type of a cloth. That didn't last very long because cotton became more popular to provide a material for all the clothing that was worn. Necessity brought a lot of really innovative things and businesses into the community in the early years. They of course made their own shoes years ago out of leather. They repaired their own shoes. They cut them. Actually, there were in the very first decade or two, there were even wooden shoemakers in this immediate community, again utilizing the wood and utilizing the tree. We have a display here of wooden patterns, gears, nuts, shafts, pulleys, a variety of things, all hand carved with a pocket knife and a file, and they in turn were taken to St. Mary's and put into cast and put into molds, and these gears would be into a cast gear, and they're all a part of a Cook Brothers molasses farm. And that was a farm originated by the Cook Brothers' grandpa, who was the very first person to settle and come into New Knoxville with his in-laws and several other families. And for about 50 years they had a molasses cane factory. Molasses is a product of a sorghum stalk that's pressed, and the juices and the sap of that is boiled to directions or to a degree, and a very sweet molasses was used. The other sweet ingredient, of course, were honeybees and honey hives of honey, and the extraction of honey was also very, very popular in that. So it's absolutely amazing what surfaces in the attics and the storage buildings after 100 and 125 years, and they still had they contributed to the present life of the 1870s and then of course improved their life over a period of years. On this one side are some pieces of equipment that were used for the harvesting of grain. We have to keep in mind that for probably 50 years, in some areas, all the grain meaning oats, flax, wheat, and wheat was the essential one for the baking of bread, and all of that was cut with a hand scythe or a cradle. And then it wasn't until about the 1870s that a grain binder come by and put the long oats and wheat into bundles, of which they would put into shocks, and of which then they would thrash and make straw stacks, and that was a part of the entire cycle of growing grains. Corn was a later crop that would be harvested into the fall. And of course then a binder came to make corn shocks. Prior to that, every ear or every large ear was stripped from the stalk by hand, put on a wagon and stored in special aerated buildings to dry that corn on the ear. The other specialty that was really needed by the farmers over the years were a form of seed selection. And here they would sort out the very largest ears and shell them, and they would have grates or strainers or sieves that would get the most ideal kernel. And they would also have devices that would take all the chaff and the undesirable things from the grains, and so that they would be sowing again into the soil the grains for next year's crop. And that was somewhat of a specialty, because in the summer or the fall they would arrange and select their seed for next year's crop. What's often overlooked is, and I candidly make a comment, that the most successful farmer was the one who could sharpen his tools the sharpest. And there were very primitive stones. This is a more recent one that you pedaled like a bicycle and it went around. In the log cabin we have one where a person had to turn it with his hands. And then a person would hold the knife, the axe, whatever was used that he wanted to use as sharpening. But if you think about it, the first several decades, everything was cut with a sharpened instrument, starting from the trees to the corn to the grain, different grain varieties. And quite honestly, the person who was the most successful in having a sharp butcher knife to a sharp corn knife certainly succeeded and was a more progressive farmer to that extent. So across the country there were various methods of harvest and various methods of harvesting. Then it evolved into a thrash machine crew where the huge steam engine was the main source of power, and then of course they were replaced with the more modern tractors. But in between all of the work that was required of them seasonally, they would have specialty things to repair shoes, to repair horse harnesses. And here a person could sit on this wooden device and simply hold the leather tight, and he could, with a strong hand muscles, put a sharp needle through there and slowly sew together and repair some of the harnesses. But in this circle of life, we do have an old hand pump, almost all made out of wood. Even the handle is out of wood, and they would, the water was of course primarily essential. This community was blessed, from the town particularly, the community was blessed with artesian wells. And at the turn of the century, the pressure from the artesian wells would come into the second floors of most of the houses. So thing was seasonal, was butchering, and they would butcher both beef and both hogs and chickens. And so again, a lot of that meat was canned. In the early years, a lot of the meat was smoked. We visited the smokehouse, and here again, the meat, the amount of butchering, and every family did it. And one of the unique things in the culture of the communities is that families or neighbors would come together, and several, up to 3 to 4 to 5 families would come together for the thrashing. They come together for the butchering. They come together for the shredding of the corn, and they wouldn't necessarily come for the general planting of the seeds, but they'd also come together for the sawing of the wood. And another responsible job was in the winter months, enough wood was accumulated to provide firewood to heat every meal that was eaten, and of course to heat at least the kitchen and provide heat for all the butchering and the boiling of water and that. So wood was, again, the primary source of heat or primary source of energy in the preparation of the food for human bodies. After about in the 1920s or thereabouts, when the ice box became popular, this museum has a very, very unique piece of equipment that was to be drawn by a one horse. That horse incidentally wore 4 special shoes with inch-long spikes, and that horse would walk on the ice of ponds. And another thing that was harvested was ice in the wintertime, of course. And when ice got to be 6 to 8 to 10 inches thick, this device would be drawn across there, and some sharp iron pieces there would mark the ice 2 ways. And that, again, they could saw that up, and they would pick that up with tongs, and after it was marked, it provided an ice block that would fit all of the ice chests that were popular, very popular in the 1920s, 30s, and certainly before electricity. So it was one of the luxuries of life at that point in time to have ice, and that's an extremely unique, probably the only tool that didn't originate in this community. But an unusual small trough where the slaughtered hogs would butcher. There was a system of taking all the hair off the hogs. They would literally scald them. It's interesting that the intestines were used to put sausage in. Everything was ground up. Everything was utilized from the hog. There's a standing early joke that everything was utilized in a hog except the squeak. And literally there were, the blood was even used for a blood pudding, and pig's feet was popular, and they were all prepared in a way that tasted good and provided food for the growing families and the continuation of families. Another unique thing is a broom maker. Some of these were cottage industries. One family would be specialized in making brooms. We have some small baskets here. Some families would specialize in weaving baskets from strips of hickory and ash that were found locally. This broom holder or maker has no metal. It's all put together with wooden pegs. And here again, in the very early decades, nails were not unheard of, and many log cabins were put together with virtually no metal whatsoever. So, of course, that changed. The innovation, the necessity brought many changes and new products along, and created more businesses, and so that's the progress of agriculture. And here again, we're talking in the middle 1800s, where 4 out of 5 people were directly related to agriculture in providing their own food for their own families. We sport a authentic school bell, a bell that was in the Brookside School just east of New Knoxville. Bells were a very important part of the life. In the early days, every farmstead had a bell. and a bell was pulled and rang in length when there was a disaster and when neighbors needed help. The bell was usually rung to bring the farmers and the sons in to bring them home for the noon meal. The woman would, the mother of the family would ring the bell, and sometimes there was a code on how many times it would ring. It's not in the most appropriate place here in the peak of this barn, but they were in the schools, and it was a signal when school was finished, it was a signal when school was out, and then above all, these bells, larger bells, were of course used in every church that anyone knows of in the rural area. But in the very, very early years, there were horns or bells that was a means of communicating between neighbors when there was a death or a disaster or something like that. So it's interesting that the means of communications that were developed before there was telephone and before there were roads, there was a way that the human being communicated very effectively in the growth in the early years of the rural areas of the U.S. In the lower part of the barn, in the center here, we have numerous things that really symbolize the wood or the forest that existed when they first came in. This is actually a storage tree. This is actually a tree that was made into a storage bin. It's probably over 4 foot in diameter, and it's not the stump, but this was a sycamore tree, and it just gives an indication of the size of trees that existed. And so then we've got some material here that this is an original saw used at Lock 6 that sawed in one direction going down, and it was sort of a pit saw, a very slow way, but it was the first system of making boards from huge logs. And then actually it wasn't until about the 1860s and 70s when circular saws came through, run by steam power, and this unusual thing was a cistern which was in the upstairs. We think the attic or the first stairs were not, or upstairs, we're not sure, but it collected rainwater, and this provided a shower and a dribble shower or rainwater that was collected and used for bathing and for cooking. Most people don't realize that rainwater is naturally soft and does not need softening, and the water from the sky is ideal to wash clothing in. So then it goes around into some other, this is what they would call a Hüvelbank, and this is extremely old, made in probably about the 1860s, handmade, strictly handmade. The auger and the vices still had the wood bolt or circular system in it, and the Hüvel meant planing. And there's another vice type of thing, and they could plane and carve or do whatever they would with boards and certain pieces. They were used to make some of the crude furniture. The other really antiquated piece is the Schnitzelbank, and anybody that has a German heritage has certainly heard of the song where they use "Ist das nicht ein Schnitzelbank?" And that is, and Schnitzel means cut, and the person would just simply sit there, and with a sharp knife or a Tochmest, draw knife, they could make whatever shape of wood that they wanted, and of course patience and time was not calculated in those days. So the other display is that the numerous businesses that we've had in the community. We do have 3 rings of wood hanging up there, and those 3 rings are hoops. And one of the first factory that hired people was a hoop factory, which in turn ended up to be the present-day Hoagie Lumber Company. And those are hoops that went around wooden barrels. Again, wood barrels, wood boxes, wood containers, and the fact with the barrels, they would pack smoked portions of pork into those barrels. They could roll them easily on the canal boats. One man could do that, and that was a form of shipping into Cincinnati and Toledo. New Knoxville, St. Mary's, New Bremen, and Minster were geographically located to a great advantage of being very close or along the Miami and Erie Canal, which was functional from about the 1850s till about the 1900, and then of course railroads took over. New Knoxville is unique in that it's never had a newspaper and never had any railroads through it, but yet it survived with numerous businesses, and we have pictures and short stories of machinery dealers, car dealers, and all the necessities that were became into existence in the early 1900s. We even formed our own telephone company, which still exists very strongly, and we had excellent telephone service since about 1905, 1910. We've honored a few people. We do have an interesting story about an Elmer Cruzy who actually worked for the CCC. That is the Commodity Credit Corporation, and it came into power during World War II and after World War II, and Elmer Cruzy was cited by Harry Truman. He was acquainted to President Roosevelt, but they were involved in the Marshall Plan. At that point in time, one of the largest world commodity corporations that rebuilt Europe after World War II. Just as again a contrast, wood, here's a wooden chain from one piece of wood made out of a professional whittler by the name of Fred Fletterjohn. He made some very, very unique things. It was his hobby or sideline until he died, and it was just something that he enjoyed doing, and it's every link is carved and from a knife, and it took very long. The chain is 40 foot long. The piece of wood may have only been maybe 15 foot long, and it's a unique system, a lost art. Just by coincidence, as what was became available as we were accumulating things, we have two egg nests. Not many museums will, I'm sure, have egg nests, but we had two enthused and energetic people in the village of New Knoxville that applied for a patent on egg nests. And this one was a rollaway egg nest, and it served its purpose because the women became involved in the chicken business, and you could collect the eggs here without having your hand picked by the hen. And so the other person had an idea of a community egg nest, and here all the chickens would enter into one opening on the side, and of course then false eggs were there. Now both egg nests, the theory was for the egg to roll away from the chicken so that the egg would stay clean and be a more it could easily be sold, and eggs were one of the first items that they traded with the local merchants. The local merchants could readily pass them on to the customers as the stores grew with some. As the stores grew with the progress of civilization. Got to remember, each little village had their outside toilet. In the more progressive years, they would put the outside toilet into these town barns. These town barns were necessary because that provided a place for their home. These local town barns all had provided outside toilets. Prior to that, there were generally separate buildings outside the house. Sometime on the farms, they all had outside toilets, and they were in the village for nearly 100 years from the very first years of when the area developed. So, and then these town barns, of course, were needed for. This is all before electricity, all before automobile and things like that. We've got a little corner here with cream separators. At one time there were at least 3 businesses in New Knoxville that bought cream. And by this point in time, in the late 1800s, early 1920s, most farmers had from 5 to 6 cows, and everybody in the family would milk them by hand, and cream became a very popular commodity. It was one of the first things that was sold, and it would give a regular monthly income to the farmers. And they made butter out of it. It kept people healthy, and ice cream started to develop, and so there were various methods of cream separators. Along with other businesses that provided a growing improvement and improved the way of life for both the community towns, for the people in the community, and for sure on the family farms. As recent as World War II, about half of the population in the United States were still agricultural on the farm. To this point, there's only about 2% of the entire population of the United States is presently engaged in agriculture. Along this one wall, we have one of the most unique collections of memorabilia we think, of nearly every business that ever existed in the village of New Knoxville. And there are dozens and dozens, it may go into the hundreds, of items that are marked with a business. And they all are promoting everything from restaurants to clothing stores, to, at one time, there were 2 businesses that delivered milk to the door. We had our own bank, by the way. And all of these, every year, they were reaching for new businesses, and they had very clever ways to put things into print and to promote their businesses. We produced brick in this community for some of the early brick church and houses. We had our own tile mill, which made drainage tiles for the community, or for the rural farms, which the drainage tiles greatly improved the productivity and yields of many of the crops, particularly legumes and corn. And so we did have one saloon in town, and that sold beer. Generally, we've only ever had only one place that would serve an intoxicating liquor. The community grew up in a very religious atmosphere, and the drinking and the partying were frowned upon, of course, by the major 2 churches in the community. So there was a place called Adolph's, which started in about 1936, and he had a business there as a restaurant and a gathering point, and many of these things have surfaced from that business. The main street of New Knoxville changed significantly over the years. Many of the older first frame buildings were moved or torn down. At one time, in about the 1920s and 30s, we had up to 4 automobile dealers in this immediate community. It was a growing thing, of course, of interest. Then at that point in time, roads needed to be improved, and motorcycles were very, very popular to a younger generation in the 1910s and 15s. Motorcycles were actually more in numbers in the community at one point in time than automobiles. Although we were not sluggish in getting automobiles or having dealerships, because it was a means of communicating and travel and enhancing your life to some extent. We started a fire department of our own. It's interesting that the early years, the 1900s, firemen were exempt in working on the roads. For several decades, each individual farm or property owner were responsible for working 1 day a month to improve the roads with a shovel and a rake in a very crude and simple method. But firemen were exempt from that. The businesses still remain to some extent in this community. However, because of the mode or the travel or the use of the automobile certainly changed the picture both into the community and into the rural areas. We have, it's interesting, the advertisements, how enticing and inviting they are with terminology. They want individuals were very outspoken in wanting your business and telling and putting it in pretty plain words. And then, of course, more memorabilia of various jewelers and tile makers and realty. And one of the larger businesses that contributed to the farm income was the Dedge and Grain Company. And fortunately, the Dedge and Grain Company had another place of business in Moulton, Ohio, which was New Knoxville's closest and most popular access to the railroad system. In the early days, Lock 2 was the companion town to New Knoxville for the outlet of the rural products that were produced. And then in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Dedge and Grain at Moulton, Ohio, where at that point in time, our telephone company reached both of those little, those two little companion towns, and Dedge and Grain then in Moulton and New Knoxville were compatible in moving out the grains and products, and above all, bringing products and necessity items in for the improvement and the growth of the rural agriculture. So one of the jobs in the early several decades, of course, was farming, but almost on the same level, the carpentry and the skills of carpentry were abundant and learnt very fast amongst the rural families, and then even the families that moved into the village. That's Adolf in his life. Harold Thies. This picture is of Adolf Henschen and his wife Lydia in the last years when they had the business called Double A Restaurant. And the other gentleman sitting in a rocker is Harold Thies. All three of those have passed on. Actually, Double A was a nickname that some woman called him at one point in life when there was no official or proper name for the restaurant. And some lady hollered across the street and says, "Hey, Double A, when are you going to open?" And so then, and it was motivated because there was a fellow by the name of Schrolicki who wanted to paint a sign. And so then to paint the sign and the name of the restaurant, and so that's how it got Double A, and that's his middle, those are his initials, A.A. Henschen. He was a World War II veteran and had left the community and kind of traveled around, and then came back to work on the home farm for a short time, and he was the youngest one in his family. Very, very interesting life and a very interesting icon of the community that provided a business, and a lot of people worked for him and with him. A recent piece that we brought into this barn is a handmade door that came off of a smokehouse, or it was the door that closed the smokehouse, and it was very pitch black. This was the inside, and we washed it with ammonia water, and it turned out to be really tremendous quality wood. But some of the boards are tapered, and it has the usual battens across the top and the bottom, all square nails. Actually, the first nails that came into existence were made one at a time by a blacksmith, and then of course they soon developed machinery that would clip and snap nails. But of all the smokehouses that I've ever seen, every one had a lock on their door, and it was partially because things were stolen. It's quite common that even chickens would be stolen. So there was that quality of life that existed even 100 and 150 years ago as well. There still are some smokehouses that have metal rods over the windows or the openings, again to prevent theft, because there was a period of time in the or in about the 1930s that it was quite common that tramps or, basically tramps would travel the area and go from home to home and beg food, and some would have a little talent of trimming trees or do short periods of labor, but they would often be beggars and would want something to eat. There's even stories where some people would purposely leave hay.
What is this all about now?
This is a blinder that was probably put on a rooster or some hens, and that would prevent them from picking each other or with their bill. Chickens at some time through the course of a year have a tendency to be attracted to raw flesh or to blood, and this was on the top of their bill, and then a little pin would go in there, and they would wear that for the entire season. But just an interesting thing that contributed to the chicken industry. We have to take it for what it's worth, but in 1941, the Blue Ribbon Hatchery Incorporated, New Knoxville, Ohio, telephone 91, put on their calendar nation's largest dealers in fancy hatching eggs. And so we have about a dozen trucks lined up here, all Blue Ribbon Hatchery, and the gentleman's name who are in charge. There was a William Cruzy that was president, and a O.F. Bikeman that was vice president, and an A.L. Cruzy that were secretary and treasury. So they put this calendar out, which is very colorful, and it's a high-tech calendar, because here on January 1 is in red, and so then what happens January 19th in red is that the egg will hatch. And if the eggs went into the incubator January 5th, they would hatch January 26th. And in black, if January the 12th, they would go into the incubator, they would hatch February 2nd. So that color code is that scientific, high-tech piece of material that relates to the incubation of eggs. And I think over all the period of time, eggs are very exact on the length of time that it takes to hatch. That has not been altered by all the scientific advances of modern day agricultural. So,
and have you talked about this?
Yeah, but as a sideline, one of the sideline comment in the chicken industry, the chicken flocks were generally tended by the women, and the gathering of eggs and the selling of eggs generally tended to be the money or the income from the wife or the woman of the farm. So that was a motivating force for a growing poultry industry here, and it would just add to it.
She could take care of her families with that.
She had money for her to spend and to manage, or the lady of the house had money for her to work with.
Oh, I love these things because you didn't get pecked.
Yeah.
Oh, but they were expensive.